I don't want guests to tell Washington about Washington. The goal had been what from outside an ecosystem helps people understand something with a little more texture, a little more nuance, creates curiosity, because I think creating curiosity gets people to explore more, gets people to be open-minded. That's where you get solutions from.
Welcome to Babel, Translating the Middle East, a podcast from the Middle East Program at CSIS. Here on Babel, we take you behind the headlines to take a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East and why it matters. This week on Babel, we bring you something special. I talk with Jon Alterman, who you know as the creator of Babel and the show's host since it began in 2019. We discuss Jon's reflections on 22 years directing the CSIS Middle East Program, his analysis of how the Middle East policy ecosystem has changed during that time, and his advice to those entering the field. We also discuss the lessons Jon will take to his new CSIS role as the Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy. To translate some of what's happening in the Middle East, this is Babel. Jon, thanks for joining me on Babel.
Thank you, Will.
How does that feel to be the other way around?
It's a little bit strange to be at the other end, but fun.
Well, I'm looking forward to this. And part of what I want to understand today is how you got into this and how your views on the region, on the role of think tanks have changed over the course of your career. So you didn't necessarily have a very straightforward pathway into a think tank because you started by doing a PhD in history, and then you chose to go from that into policy-focused work. Can you talk to us about that decision? Why did you want to make that shift?
So before I got the PhD in history, I worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years for Senator Moynihan, doing foreign policy and defense. It struck me at the time that the world is divided between substance people and process people. And substance people go and accrue wisdom, and process people deploy that wisdom and have very wide-ranging skills and can use them in different circumstances. And there was a foreign policy advisor for Senator Ted Kennedy, who struck me as the ultimate process person. And whether it was South Africa sanctions or funding for some of the wars in Central America or anything else, he understood the people, he understood the processes, he got stuff done. And I said, and Congressman Jerry Connolly was then a staffer. He was another guy amazing at process. I said, that's not really where my strength is. I think where I'd like my strength to be is to be a substance person and to be one of those people who accrues wisdom over time. The sort of preeminent way to become a substance person is to get a PhD. But even when I was doing my PhD, I was much more policy oriented than most people in my program. There was a professor, Peter Sluglet, British professor with a wry sense of humor, who used to sometimes call me Senator, because I wasn't like most other historians. I was interested in thinking about how governments have engaged with problems. And my dissertation was about Egypt and American foreign assistance in the early 1950s, which was partly about how the United States grappled with anti-communism, how it thought about what development was, what kinds of disciplines were involved in development, how the Egyptians thought about those problems and the kinds of conflicts that came out of it. So in some ways, it sort of started off and stayed in a policy track, which went back to my undergraduate major in public policy.
I want to come back to the state piece, but I want you to put your historian's hat on for a minute first. What was the field like at that time when you were entering, the field? And what were the types of people who were filling those roles?
Well, one thing that happened when I was in graduate school is the Oslo Accords were signed, and you really seemed like you were moving to a very different place in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And there was a great deal of optimism that we had reached a breakthrough moment. Toward the end of graduate school, there seemed to be a lot of movement on Iran. And with President Khatami, there was a sense that this very long period of tension with Iran may be ending, and that the Iranian revolution had essentially run out of steam. There was, I think, a battle inside history departments about what constitutes good history, and in many ways, things that involve governments were falling out of favor. Political history was really losing. And there was a theoretical bent in the field that the Harvard History Department didn't really have. So in some ways, the Harvard History Department was a sort of an odd man out in the academic study of history. But I think more broadly, in the Middle East field, there was a sense that we had been working our way through a lot of the traditional problems in the region. Certainly, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was one of the first things that happened when I was up at Harvard. But I think there was more optimism, partly in this post-Cold War world, that we were going to be able to reach escape velocity. And in many ways, the Middle East was going to become a more normal region in the world than it had been for the previous several decades.
And this was sort of the, not that much after the end of history and that sort of discussion, right?
I helped Senator Moynihan write his response to the end of history essay. I never agreed with it, I think for the same reasons that I don't agree with it now, which is, it seemed to me that authoritarianism has a lot more momentum than Frank Fukuyama gave it credit for in 1989, and that a lot of people gave authoritarianism credit for during the Arab Spring.
So tell me about that. How has the region changed? How would you characterize it today?
Partly, the Gulf is a very different and I think remarkably self-confident place in a way the Gulf had not been. There's a lot less self-confidence in the Levant, which for so long had considered itself to be the civilized center of the Middle East. I think that the difficulty in actually escaping some of these conflicts has made some people in the Middle East less intent to fight them because it seems a little bit hopeless. I certainly get a sense from Iran that younger people are feeling like there's no way to get rid of this bad government. Iraqis are much less optimistic than they were after the immediate fall of Saddam. I think there's a lot of nihilism all over. And in many ways, the Gaza war has reinforced this sense that there's really no solution to all of these problems. And for some people, I've been surprised that people say, well, I just don't want to fight this anymore because there's no solution to it. And the extent to which that endures, the extent to which some of these issues come back, I think a lot depends on what follows Abu Mazen. But Abu Mazen has sort of frittered away a lot of the passion that a lot of people throughout the region had for the Palestinian cause. Yasser Arafat had been very good at nurturing that over time. Where that goes, is a little bit surprising to me because the notion 25 years ago when I did a book on new media in the Arab world was that it gave an immediacy to the Arab-Israeli conflict it never had before. People were seeing in their living rooms what this conflict really looked like. And there was a sense that this was going to prompt people to be more passionate. And in fact, 20 years, 25 years of seeing things seems to have numbed people to this issue in a way that I think I find a little bit surprising. It's not what people expected 25 years ago.
So we've sort of transitioned from this optimism to more of a pessimism and a numbness, as you're saying, about the region. How does that change how the region is studied today? What trends do you see there?
I think first there's certainly optimism in the Gulf that wasn't there before, and it's much more homegrown. You have a lot more people from the region who are in the front lines and are making decisions, and I think that's a very different mood than there was. I think what I see in the academic study of the region, and it's true of academic studies more broadly, is it's just gotten so much narrower. So much of the academic work doesn't transcend barriers, often doesn't transcend states. It feels like it is more and more focused on smaller and smaller issues that don't necessarily have a bearing on the kinds of decisions that people are making. And academics need to appeal to their disciplinary audiences. And so in many ways, the people who make tenure and promotion decisions are not experts on an individual situation. They're experts on a discipline, on an approach. And I think that's driven a lot of the academic work to not be so helpful as, say, understanding the kinds of choices that people make, whether in government or outside of government. It feels like it's intended for a peer audience, but not for a regional audience and not for other audiences. And I think for a lot of people in the Middle East, when I talk to people in governments or even people in academia, a lot of the academic work that people do in the region isn't valued by the people in the region because it doesn't really address the kinds of questions they're interested in ways they think are relevant.
You mentioned earlier your time in the State Department, and I wonder, we're talking about the early 2000s, right? So I wonder how that shaped your views on what it means to be in this policy world, the policy-making ecosystem. How did that change how you think about the role of government on Middle East policy?
So the State Department was a bastion of circumspection about the wisdom of attacking Iraq. I certainly knew everybody who had written a book about Iraq in English. At the time, I could gather them all around my dining room table. It's a tiny handful of people. And I think for a lot of people in the State Department, the overwhelming sense of uncertainty was there, but there also was the view coming from the White House and elsewhere that 9/11 was a generational challenge and it required a much bolder response than the State Department was able to generate. And in some ways, there was a sense that the people who had the boldness of vision and the commitment to win the Cold War were now going to push back the age of terrorism. And it wasn't clear we weren't entering an age of mass catastrophe terrorism. So the State Department was a little bit of a weird place to be in that and was always cautious of being marginalized in the broader governmental process. But it seemed to me that what the State Department really needed was to have people help frame issues. I really thought that second-guessing people in government or talking about how I do my past or future jobs in government differently from the people who actually had them isn't really helpful. It's mostly annoying. And so the question is, what can I know that they're curious about? How do I take random things I know from random conversations I've had and put them into a package that gives people a framework and understanding that they can then apply as they get more timely information than I have access to, or more secret information that I have access to. But how can you help guide people to make better choices? How do you tell them what they don't know? And one of the places where I really tried to do this, and have been doing it for a long time, is on China-Middle East issues, which was not an obvious issue when I started doing it shortly after I came to CSIS. But it struck me that there's a lot to understand. And if you can frame it and give people a sort of sense of orientation of how to think about it, you can really add what the system is bad at doing. The system is good at making incremental decisions. It's bad at framing things afresh. And it seemed to me that one of the things we could do is frame things. And to me, the attraction of being in a think tank space is how can you look at issues that are otherwise neglected and bring attention to them in constructive ways that help people solve problems. So I've never wanted to just do Arab-Israeli issues, Iran issues, Iraq issues, the sort of known categories with the known parameters. To me, there's always been more attraction in finding areas that people don't understand are important and framing them, making them memorable, helping people think about them in ways that guide them toward better decisions, more creative decisions, maybe some unexpected outcomes that can make things better.
And you have certainly pushed me a lot throughout my time here with my writing to really think about how I'm framing something and to frame it in a memorable way. So it sounds like this is something that you think continues to be a really key role for think tanks.
I think realistically, the information stream that we get outside of government can't compare to the information stream that people get inside of government. And certainly when I read the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief, which was a top secret document that you had to read in a special room, that was the summary of all the most important intelligence items of the day. If you had a choice between reading the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief for the New York Times, you should choose the New York Times, because it's very rare that things in the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief wouldn't be in the New York Times within a day or two. But the New York Times put it in a way that was memorable. Journalists know that you start with a lead and you have to grab somebody's attention. And the goal of journalists is to have the reader take away the information. The goal of writing the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief is to say everything in such exquisitely correct a way that nobody can tell you had the intelligence wrong. but it's not written in a way that has the most important stuff at the top that tells you where the breaking news is. It's written to be correct. And I think there are a number of documents that came out in the 9/11 Commission report that sort of highlight the way a lot of government information is handled. I think what we should be doing in think tanks is thinking about storytelling skills. As you know, I've worked on storytelling skills for policy audiences. I've worked to produce things that are intended to draw the audience in. I think what we have in the think tank world is the freedom to say, I want this to be the takeaway. How do I build a product that gets my audience's attention and has them remember what I want them to remember? Oftentimes, people aren't going to remember data points. It's hard to remember data points. It's easy to remember framing, especially when it's in the context of stories. And I think out of that framing, that's where you're adding value. Sometimes the framing is the title. If somebody can remember the title of what you wrote, that sometimes everything falls from that. But I think, again, the advantage that we have in the think tank world is we're so free in what we do and how we do it, that to think about how do I have the desired impact? How do I choose information that has the desired impact? And how do I present it in a way that a week later, and you and I have had this conversation a number of times, a week later, what do you want somebody to remember you said? Because the reality is, a week later, people barely remember the big topic you talked about, let alone what your takeaway was. And if they don't remember the takeaway, what are we doing?
But if you surprised them, if you intrigued them, then they're much more likely to remember. And I think that has only become more important with the saturation of the media landscape.
And this is a huge change since I started. You know, when we started the newsletter in the Middle East program, it was relatively new. We had a format that was 2 pages of a PDF that was all laid out. I had senators who were delighted because they said you can actually take something away. It's only 2 pages and you learn something, and it was pointed and it was sharp. I currently get about 250 emails a day. And that's not to mention all the social media stuff and the scrolling and all the things that go on. The saturation, I mean, I've said for 15 years, and it's becoming ever more true every year. We're competing with sleep. I mean, there's no end of information you can gather, which I think puts an even greater premium on how do you frame, how do you pick and choose so you're making a difference in this space. Because to just be part of a cacophony doesn't contribute.
What else has changed in the role that think tanks play in Washington, D.C. in this policy-making ecosystem? Apart from the information saturation piece, how do you view think tanks having a different role today to when you joined CSIS?
You know, I think one of the most dramatic changes is there used to be a much more personal element to it. And I think it's partly because of so much going on in the Middle East space and partly because of COVID. I think for young people starting, they don't know everybody. I tell you, I had a 1-year postdoc at the Washington Institute. And by the end of the year, I really did know everybody in the Middle East space in Washington. I had met them. I had seen them at conferences. I'd had meals with them. I just knew everybody. And I think it's much, much harder. It's much more depersonalized. It's harder to gather people. I also think that there's a way in which COVID interrupted a pattern of folks in government engaging with non-governmental folks. It used to be much more common to bring people in. I go to the State Department now. I've been in the State Department. It's been for a long time. The small number of visitors to the State Department compared to 10 or 15 years ago is shocking to me. I mean, it used to be quite a process set up with a whole bunch of clerks and, you know, they would get you in and get you out. Now they've made it so cumbersome, partly for security reasons, partly for whatever reason, that I think there's a lot less interchange. I don't think that's good. I think that there was a lot to be gained from having trusted relationships. And I think ultimately much of the impact I've had has been from having a one-on-one conversation with somebody. And I think realistically, the number of people having one-on-one conversations inside of government, outside of government, has decreased significantly over the last 10 years, maybe more. Some of that is because of political polarization, and people don't want to talk to people that they don't know they agree with to start with. But I think there's a depersonalization that has accompanied the rise of smartphones and other kinds of things that there's just, oh yeah, I saw you wrote something about that, but do you remember what I wrote about it? I mean, it's different from sitting down and having a conversation and actively listening. And I think people's listening skills have declined.
So talking about people's listening skills, why did you want to launch a podcast? How did the idea for Babel come about?
It wasn't an incredibly deliberate idea. I was talking to some people. I was talking to some friends at the UAE embassy who were interested, and I said, I love podcasts. And we didn't have a strategic plan. We got a little bit of advice about how to do a podcast. We've changed the format a little bit over time. We did some mini-series. We had no idea how to do a mini-series. And then we did them. And it's really been one of the most rewarding things I've done at CSIS, partly because it allows me to model curiosity, which I think is so important a task, to really be curious about the world and to think about ways to elicit interesting answers from people. It's been fun thinking about guests. It's been fun thinking about how to approach the interviews I've done. It's been fun being surprised at what I heard. And again, ultimately, I think there's so much you get from really engaging with people. And I think both the interviews and then the tabletop conversations we had are really ultimately about the best kind of exchange, respectful, curious conversations with people who have different perspectives. And my goal always was that a listener would come away and say, that topic is so much more interesting than I ever thought it would be. Because I think the ideal way to see the world is a world full of curiosities and interesting things that bear more inquiry. And Babel has just been this remarkable vehicle for me to indulge my own curiosity, to talk to people I never would have talked to otherwise, sometimes old friends who've had remarkable experiences, and to help people be the stars that they often are if you give them an opportunity to really show how their interesting, unique perspectives bear in the world.
And I'm not going to ask you to name drop, but I think both you and I have been surprised by some of the people who've told us that they've listened across the years. It's been really fun to have the chance to look into everything from Turkish soaps in the Middle East to Captagon to, some of the hot topics of the day, but not exclusively those hot topics.
And again, this fits into my goal of not just doing what people know they're interested in, but having an ear open to things that people might not understand or as interesting as they are, or somebody with a unique perspective that can really help inform in a surprising way. I think the Middle East is a really interesting place, a complex place. It is understood, not only in the United States, but especially in Washington, in a much more narrow perspective than I think makes sense to people in the region. And I've always, as you know from the many conversations we had about guests, I don't want guests to tell Washington about Washington. The goal had been what from outside an ecosystem helps people understand something with a little more texture, a little more nuance, creates curiosity, because I think creating curiosity gets people to explore more, gets people to be open-minded. That's where you get solutions from, not from a point-counterpoint of having two people repeating opposite talking points that could have been written 20 years ago. And one of the frustrations I have about Middle East studies is people are using talking points for decades.
Some of the people who I think have told both you and me that they listen to the podcast are students and those who are earlier on in their career. And you have, I don't know how many thousands of applications you've looked at. I have probably also looked at thousands. And I wonder what advice you have for those who now are considering entering a career in Middle East policy, particularly those who are intrigued by the idea of a think tank, but who are probably quite nervous about the shifts underway in the ecosystem in Washington, D.C., and what a future career might look like. What advice would you have for them?
So one is to engage with reality. I think a lot of people come out of undergraduate or even graduate degrees, and they've stuck within the categories that people have given them. The most interesting things I've learned in the Middle East have been from random conversations, from getting off the well-beaten path. It's sometimes when you're on the beaten path, you know something random that gives you sort of credibility or authenticity, and you can get somebody who's on the beaten path to say something interesting. Sometimes it's having a conversation just randomly that you learn something and you can bring it back and it helps inform something else about the region that isn't commonly known. So I think there's an indispensability in my mind of having a genuine encounter with the region and it being intellectually uncomfortable, seeking out things that don't make sense. You want things that don't make sense, and then you want to struggle to have them make sense. And that process of going from it doesn't make sense to it makes sense is like athletic training. You get better at it. And I think it's that muscle of finding things that don't make sense, making sense of them, finding things that don't make sense, making sense of them. That's, I think, a lot of what education should be about and a lot of what being in the think tank space should be about. I think the other thing is there is still no substitute for expressing yourself clearly. And I don't know exactly how to teach it. I try to teach it to the extent I can. But I really think that for applications I read, sometimes people are just really good at expressing themselves. Sometimes you feel people are probably good at expressing themselves, but they're wrapped up in jargon because they need to demonstrate to somebody that they know the jargon. And then there are some people who the jargon is just a distraction. They can't figure out what they're really trying to say. And I think being able to speak clearly, write clearly, remains an invaluable skill. I don't know how it's being taught outside of the Middle East program. I certainly tried to teach people inside the Middle East program, as you know.
I do indeed.
But I think that clarity of thought, and part of that is coming up with a good metaphor, coming up with good framing, coming up with a lead that grabs people's attention, not making people wonder where you're going. I mean, there's a lot involved. But I think what people are ultimately looking at from me and colleagues is they want somebody to really be a guide to take them by the hand and tell them how to understand something. They don't want to wonder where is this going. You have to give them confidence that you're taking them on a journey and it's going to end up in a good place.
And a few years ago, you wrote a document that contains a lot of advice for people who are applying for jobs in this. And I think a lot of people have said how helpful that is. We'll put it in the show notes for this. But the more specific pieces of advice from some of the mistakes that people have made. We've talked about putting a sort of lowlights of some of the funniest things we see in applications. I think probably a good thing that we've not done that. But certainly sometimes people do shoot themselves in the foot, I think, in unfortunate ways. So if you are applying, that's something then please do check.
I actually only edited that document. There was a very talented RA who had been through 450 applications and was so frustrated that really talented people took themselves out of the running by telling folks at CSIS how much they wanted to work at the Carnegie Endowment or something like that. Or people who said, I witnessed the Arab Spring because they were passing through Cairo Airport, in January 2011. I think I'd love to help people be as successful as they can be. The think tank world is a small and idiosyncratic world. I think it's hard to focus only on the think tank space and have a successful career. But again, what I like about the think tank space is there aren't a lot of rules for how you create value. And there's constant pressure. How do you add value? And I think if you're going to have pressure, that's a good pressure to have. How do you add value? It's interesting.
Definitely. So after 22 years, you are moving on from the Middle East program and expanding your portfolio as you focus on your role as the Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy. So what is next? What lies ahead for you?
We're finishing up some work on the Hostage Commission that's coming out in the next few weeks. And then, I've been working on projects that have to do with thinking about the global south, middle powers. It grows partly out of my China Middle East work that I've been doing for almost 20 years. It grows partly out of what I've seen in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which increasingly are countries that see themselves not merely with regional roles, but with global roles. I have long been interested in understanding how India sees the world, and some projects we worked on exposing more to Indian decision makers. We commissioned some internal papers. Brazil is in an interesting place. And I think there is something going on in the world where the superpowers are still there and still matter. And the G7 is still the dominant economic and political force. But the level of its dominance is diminishing. There are growing middle powers that share some interests in how the world should operate and differ in some ways in how the world should operate. There's certainly China and Russia trying to shape how the middle powers treat those kinds of issues. And what strikes me is that you can rue the decline of the current rules-based architecture, whatever you want to call it. That all feels passive to me. The real issue, I think, is what does any of this matter? If the U.S. isn't playing that role, if other countries are playing different roles, what are the genuine economic consequences? What are the peace and security consequences? I was talking to somebody earlier today who said Sudan may be a model for what we see, where you have 10 countries that are each playing proxy wars in Sudan, including some middle powers. Is that a future condition? And does it matter if that's a future condition? What does it affect? This is the challenge for foreign policy, for global security going forward. What kind of world might we move into? How should we want it to evolve? And how are we going to account for many of these countries, often formerly colonial powers, now with quite robust economies, capacity to exercise foreign policy? It's not going to change everything, but it will change some things. What will it change? What should we want it to change? What do we do about it? It's rooted in the Middle East, obviously, because a lot of these countries are from the Middle East, but it goes beyond the Middle East, and it looks at issues like the Gulf relationships with India and with Russia and with China. How is the way they think about this different from a country like Brazil? Where does Turkey fit in, and will Turkey fit in? I'm not sure Turkey fits in. Does South Africa matter? I think there's something going on that is going to be very consequential, not because there's going to be a rival that will overwhelm the United States, but the system is going to change, partly because of what the U.S. wants to do, what the American people want to do, partly because of what the Russians and Chinese do, but I think a lot because of the creativity and determination of countries that have more agency now than they've ever had before. How does Europe evolve in that? And will Europe get more distance from the United States and be an independent actor and be a sort of a fourth power because of this? Will some of these countries want Europe to be a fourth power? I think those are the kinds of issues that we really need to pay much more attention to. I'm not comfortable people have paid enough attention to it. It's all related to the Middle East because there's so much happening in the Middle East, but it's not limited to the Middle East. And certainly it's not the traditional security problems in the Middle East, which I've in many ways spent the last 30 years trying to untangle.
Well, that's a lot to take on, but we really look forward to watching you wrestle with those thorny, difficult problems and helping, understand where we're going with all of this. I'm going to take the liberty of saying on behalf of myself and then anyone else who's listening, because I assume if they're still listening, then they're here because they care about what you think. Thank you for your leadership of the Middle East program. Thank you for creating Babel as this platform for all these different voices. And as you said, for leading with curiosity and for helping model where curiosity can take you. Thank you so much.
Will, it's been a delight not only to talk to you today, but a delight to work alongside you in the Middle East program. I still fondly remember you were hired for 6 months 8 years ago.
Yeah, how did that go? 9 years ago.
9 years ago. And it's been a delight working with you to flesh out Babel in terms of the format, in terms of the guests. It's really been a collective effort of a lot of people, some of whom our listeners have heard and many of whom they haven't heard. It has been a delightful effort to share the passion that everybody in the Middle East program has had for the region and to do what we can to make the place better, to help guide more understanding. And as I look back on my time, the regularity of Babel, the challenge of keeping Babel interesting has certainly been one of the highlights of my time leading the Middle East program. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jon.
Thanks, Will.
Thank you so much for listening. Babel is now going on hiatus, but but you can follow all the latest work of the Middle East Program under the leadership of our new director, Mona Yakubian, at www.csis.org/Mideast.